the myotatic stretch reflex circuit. When we're talking about reflex circuits, we have a number of examples that you're familiar with. For example, when you accidentally touch a hot surface, you immediately withdraw your limb. For example, if I accidentally put my hand on a hot stove or a hot plate, I will immediately yank my hand back. Other reflex actions are similar to that. It could be simply that you are walking through a door and something frightens you and you immediately jump. Those type of actions are not voluntary, meaning that you're not making a conscious decision to move your hand off of the hot surface. You could consciously try to keep your hand on that hot surface, definitely, meaning that you're going to put your hand on that hot surface, but the immediate reaction is to remove your hand. So the circuit for that, the neuronal circuit, obviously it involves the skeletal muscles. So it goes to the topic that we've been talking about in this section, or this subsection. And the neurons are connected to the muscles, forming those neuromuscular connections, but they're also routed into the spinal cord and then routed back. And that's what we're going to talk about, the circuit that doesn't involve the brain, the motor cortex. And it only involves those alpha motor neurons or those lower motor neurons and some other neurons that are also involved in it too. So when we're talking about the circuit and when we're drawing it out, we are not going to show every connection that each neuron is making at their dendrites and soma, because as we said before, neurons make thousands of synaptic connections with other neurons. So at the soma and the dendrites, you have all these synaptic connections all coming from different neurons. To us, that is not important. We are worried about that circuit and how that reflex circuit works. So myotatic stretch reflex circuit is the one that when you go to the doctor, he makes you sit down and he gets a little hammer and smacks it on your knee and your leg extends. And the doctor is literally just testing for this reflex action. So this stretch reflex resists the lengthening of a muscle. It is an important mechanism in maintaining balance and correcting posture due to changing environment. This circuit is housed in the spinal cord and does not require input from the upper motor neurons in the brain, the motor cortex. Each muscle contains a sensory organ called a muscle spindle. The muscle spindle is composed of 6 to 8 thin muscle fibers called intrafusal muscle fibers, and a sensory neuron which wraps itself around this organ. The sensory neuron is often referred to as a sensory fiber and has mechanically gated cation channels in its membrane. We are now seeing mechanically gated cation channels, and it had been introduced to way back when we were talking about ion channels and the way they're gated. Intrafusal muscle fibers or cells do not contribute to muscle contraction and are not innervated by lower motor neurons. The extrafusal muscle fibers or cells are responsible for muscle contractions. These are myocytes which are activated by lower motor neurons and are part of the motor unit discussed above. So we have intrafusal. This is part of the spindle that we're talking about here, the muscle spindle. And the extrafusal, just the normal muscle cells that are involved in contraction. When you read about muscle contraction of muscles and etc., there's this wording of muscle fibers and etc. And muscle fibers is nothing but a muscle cell because muscle cells are very long. When a muscle is stretched, the muscle spindle is also stretched along with the rest of the muscle. This mechanical change leads to mechanically gated cation channels of the sensory neuron in the spindle to open. This leads to action potentials being propagated by the sensory neuron, which is synapsing with the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord, which is innervating the myocyte, extrafusal muscle fibers, in which the spindle resides in, and an inhibitory interneuron. The inhibitory interneuron is synapsing with the lower motor neurons, which are innervating myocytes, extrafusal muscle fibers, of the antagonist muscle. The activation of the inhibitory motor neurons will lead to relaxation of the antagonist muscle by inhibiting the lower motor neurons that are innervating the antagonist muscle. This activation of muscle spindle leads to the activation of the motor units in the muscle it resides in and the inhibition of the motor units in the antagonist muscle. We're going to take this apart piece by piece. The first thing about moving a limb is that you have two muscles that are opposite each other. right? For example, you have your bicep and you have your tricep. So to extend my arm, my bicep must relax while my tricep contracts. To close my arm, my tricep needs to relax and my bicep contracts. So in the case of looking at a certain motion, for example, raising my leg and extending the joint fully, then the hamstring muscles need to relax while the quadricep muscles are contracting. You can't have both of them contract at the same time and get extension. If you're going to have an involuntary reflex, what has to happen is the correct muscle, the agonist muscle, needs to contract while the antagonist muscle, which is antagonizing that movement, needs to relax. Now, of course, both muscles, the antagonist and the agonist, are being innervated by lower motor neurons. They have their own lower motor neurons that are innervating the muscle cells, the motor units within that muscle. And here you have this picture. The thing to notice about sensory neurons is that they are different morphologically than the neurons that we've been talking about so far. And their morphology is like this. They have basically 2 axon terminal ends. Okay, so here's one end. And they keep going. And then you have another end that's synapsing with something else on this side. And then you have the cell body sort of in the middle. And usually the soma, and here's the nucleus, the soma of the sensory neurons are in the ganglias that are in different parts of the body. Now, the sensory part is over here, and the other end is synapsing with other neurons. So the signal is generated from the sensory end and travels in this direction, the action potential, until it gets all the way to the end here, where you get to these presynaptic membranes and neurotransmitters released into those synaptic clefts. Now, depending on the sensory neuron, this part right here will have different types of cation channels or sodium channels. For example, there are sensory neurons that will activate their cation or sodium channels due to changes in temperature. They can be temperature-sensitive cation channels. And for example, a sensory neuron that senses cold, it will start to have those cation channels open up when the temperature starts to get low. And more of them open up as the temperature is lowered until you get to a certain point where all the channels are maximally open. And when they're maximally open, you start to generate an action potential going toward the other end. And the other end is going to be synapsing with neurons in the spinal cord. And those neurons send the signal into the brain, and it's processed there to say that, oh, that part of my body feels cold. Same thing with heat. If it's hot, you have different sensory neurons that sense hot temperature. In the case of this sensory neuron that we're talking about, it is feeling the stretch that is happening within the muscle, because when the doctor smacks the little hammer onto your knee, that tendon is stretched, so this muscle right here, the upper muscle, the quadricep, is stretched. And what will happen is the spindle is right here. See, this is the muscle spindle right here. And since it resides in that muscle, that will be stretched too. And here's the sensory neuron that is sort of wrapped around this muscle right here. You can kind of see it. It's wrapped around. Right? And it goes all the way into the spinal cord, where part of the signal branches off and goes to the brain. Right? I mean, you do feel that smack on the knee. And the other part is synapsing with 2 different neurons right here. Right, so you have 2 different synaptic connections. Now, the way this is being drawn, just to get the notation right, is that here's the neuron's soma, then you have the axon, and then you have it synapsing. And when it synapses with another neuron, here's the cell body of the other neuron, or the dendrite. We don't really care exactly where it's synapsing. And then that has an axon which goes off to synapse with something else. You can see that this sensory neuron is synapsing with two different neurons. One neuron is right here, and another one is right here. And the one that goes off to the brain, that's going to synapse with neurons in the brain. Okay, so we have that. And now what you have in the middle right here, it is synapsing with the motor neuron. Here's the motor neuron. Here's the head, the soma, and the axon that goes all the way towards synapsing with muscle cells. And that quadricep muscle, the agonist muscle. So this is an excitatory connection. You're going to have excitement of this motor neuron, which will lead to the agonist muscle being contracted. The sensory neuron is also synapsing with an inhibitory interneuron. And here is that inhibitory interneuron. Here's the head of it. And here's the axon. And this thing is synapsing with the alpha motor neuron that is synapsing with the antagonist muscle. So the excitatory signal from the sensory neuron will activate the inhibitory interneuron, and the inhibitory interneuron is an inhibitory neuron, so it's going to release neurotransmitters which will activate transmitter-gated channels that are specific for Cl- or potassium. So the motor neuron, the alpha motor neuron that is innervating the antagonist muscle, will be inhibited, and thus it will not get a signal to contract. So it will remain in the relaxed position. So the hamstring is relaxed and the quadricep is contracted, and you have the leg move up in this reflex action. So another way to draw it, to bring everything home, you have the agonist muscle and the antagonist. You have the sensory neuron, which has one end in here basically with the muscle spindle, and it goes ahead, sends one thing off to the brain, and it's making one connection and a second connection. The first synaptic connection is with the alpha motor neuron that is innervating the agonist muscle. The next connection is with the inhibitory interneuron, which is innervating the antagonist muscle. So alpha motor neuron, or lower motor neuron, either one. Inhibitory interneuron, and just for completion, you have the soma of this thing coming off of it, like that, and that'll be in the sensory ganglias. And that's basically the circuit. You can see that an action potential that is generated here will move in this direction, right? It will go off in this direction. It will go off in this direction, right? Like this. And since this is an excitatory connection, these sensory neurons will release excitatory neurotransmitters. You get an action potential flowing down in this direction. Lead to the contraction of the agonist muscle, whereas here the inhibitory neuron is excited and you have an action potential traveling down, but this is going to release inhibitory neurotransmitters in this synaptic connection right here, and this will lead to this alpha motor neuron right here being inhibited, and thus there's no action potentials flowing down this alpha motor neuron, so the antagonist muscle will not be contracted. And that is the circuit. Okay guys, this is the end of section 2. We will continue with section 3 shortly. Thank you.